Alright, so when we were going through the 1780s on our essay preparation for the essay covering the 1780s to 1820s, I briefly went over the fact that some of the reformers and radicals within Britain opposed the American Revolution because they essentially viewed it as Englishmen killing Englishmen. And I did not mention that this was because within the United States of America there were a number of politicians and citizens still loyal to the crown. Now, I thought it would be very useful to go over one of these so you have a better understanding of the period. And personally, I think the man that we are going to go over today has been largely forgotten to history, and he is nowhere near remembered as well as he should be, and he is far, far, far below in terms of popularity of the other founding fathers such as John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and nonetheless I believe he deserves his place in history. His name was John Dickinson, and he lived between 1732 and 1808. So let's take a look at his life. Who was John Dickinson? John Dickinson was one of the most important founding fathers of the United States of America. He was one of the wealthiest men in the colonies, and he went to law school where he studied great politicians of the past of British history, might I add you, such as Edward Coke. He was very important. He was appointed by James I. We'll go over him in another time because Edward Coke is like massive in terms of the history of politics. But obviously, studying these figures heavily influenced Dickinson's views on politics, and we'll go a bit deeper into that later. So, Dickinson worked as a solicitor and acting politician, and he was dubbed the penman of the Revolution due to the plethora of writings he produced that were of great significance to the colonists at the time. One of his works was actually more popular in the colonies than Thomas Paine's Rights of Man until obviously the sales went up. But prior to Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, his work was the most popular and widely read, and he wrote it under a pseudonym of just the Farmer. So, Dickinson also famously wrote the Liberty Song in 1768, and once the American Revolution began, he served as a militiaman, which shows his dedication to his country considering the fact that he opposed the Declaration of Independence. This is because he was a conservative and a loyalist, but we'll go into what that means later. For his skill with the pen and his honour as a politician, he was highly respected by one of the greatest men in history, Thomas Jefferson. So, Dickinson's political career. During Dickinson's time in the First Continental Congress, he signed the Continental Association, which was essentially a bill that called for the colonies to partake in a trade boycott with Great Britain, and he drafted much of the petition to the king, which was essentially a petition to King George III, which denounced the intolerable acts which were put in place following the Boston Tea Party. There were pretty much punitive measures placed onto the American colonists, and they were perceived as not being very fair. And honestly, my opinion, being British myself, I believe that they were not very fair considering the fact that up until this point America had been fairly lenient to the British. When you think about stuff like the Boston Massacre, and although that does appear to be an accident, we have to remember the Americans treated our soldiers very well. John Adams represented them in court, and fortunately, he got them off of a potential execution. So, yeah, It's a straw that cuts both ways, I suppose you could say, or a knife. So, during his time in the Second Continental Congress, Dickinson wrote the 1775 Olive Branch Petition, which attempted to negotiate the colony's relations to Great Britain diplomatically, so essentially avoiding a war and the state of chaos. I suppose a Rousseauian would call it the state of nature, but being Hobbesian conservatives, we're going to say the state of chaos is more fitting, I would say. So, when the king refused to negotiate, Dickinson wrote the final draft of Thomas Jefferson's 1775 Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. Dickinson opposed the rash manner with which the other delegates in the Continental Congress called for a Declaration of Independence without a constitution first being ratified. So he attempted to alleviate some of the potential harm that could come from a nation lacking a constitution, namely it being placed into a state of chaos, by writing the first draft of the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, which was essentially the proto-constitution of the United States. So obviously from that you can probably infer this was a very, very important man. And why do we really not know about him? Well, because he'd never put his name on the Declaration of Independence because he opposed it. So, being a man of honour, Dickinson did not vote against the Declaration because the other 13 states or 12 states were in favour of it. Dickinson instead just said, okay, we're going to do this, but because I do not personally agree, I'm going to abstain, and I'm going to go and serve in the Revolutionary Army, which he did between 1776 and 1783. So, Dickinson then abstained from signing the Declaration of Independence, which, as you know, took place in 1776. And we've just got a picture there to the right. Notice how Dickinson is not present. You've got John Hancock there, though, looking very snazzy. So, what were Dickinson's politics? Dickinson was a conservative and a loyalist who would rather the colonies have remained a part of the British Empire. However, he understood the necessity of fair treatment by the Crown if the colonies were to remain loyal. So essentially fair treatment on both sides. Being a lawyer, you can see where that comes from. What is just? How can the Crown of Great Britain justly treat the Americans and vice versa? So, Dickinson's English conservative sympathies are very evident when we examine his fear of an America governed without a constitution. This would be an extension of the Hobbesian view that a state of lawlessness, or state of nature, would be nasty, brutish, and short. And of course, that is a quote from Thomas Hobbes' famous work, Leviathan, which I cannot recommend enough that you take a read if you have the time. So, it should come as no surprise that Dickinson was an English conservative, as his family was very wealthy, and he studied Edward Coke and other such figures in law school, which would have greatly influenced his views. Obviously, not all conservatives are rich or were rich, but if you have a lot of money, you're probably going to want to maintain the social order, because if there's a revolution, you're going to lose everything, like we saw with the aristocracy in France, and our poor, poor man Antoine Lavoisier, the father of chemistry. So, he was a man of duty, as he put personal convictions to one side and served his fellow countrymen when the need to do so came about. His advocacy of diplomacy with the crown also shows his Hobbesian sympathies in that he was appealing to the rational interest of the monarch. I suppose you could also consider that to be Machiavellian if you wanted. If you've ever read The Sovereign or The Prince, appeal to the rational interests of anyone you want to persuade, essentially. So, he believed that the British government had a right to legislate on behalf of the colonies, so obviously without representation. So, that was the slogan of the American Revolution, no taxation without representation. Uh, Dickinson believed that even without representation, the British government had the ability and should have the ability to have moderate control over the colonies because obviously the British set it up. However, he advocated a degree of autonomy and devolution of state governments, hence why he opposed the Intolerable Acts and the Townshend Acts. So I've already mentioned those before. So that is John Dickinson, perhaps one of the most important conservatives in America during the American Revolution, and certainly a man that is not given enough attention in history classes than is deserved of him, as the attention is largely put on to uh, the more classical liberal figures of the time, such as John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton to a degree, although I would argue he was more of a kind of Keynesian conservative, but obviously that wasn't a thing yet. Nonetheless, that is the story of John Dickinson. I hope you found this interesting, and I hope you find him to be as inspiring of a conservative figure as I do.